Hi everyone, it is beautiful and cloudy out here in Burbank this morning, and I'm going to show you guys my process with Dr. P.H. Martin's Radiant Watercolors. So I swatched them out here at the top here. I bought 2 sets of the Radiant Watercolors, and then I also bought 2 sets of the Hydrus watercolors. The Radiant watercolors are much less lightfast, and I've heard this from multiple people that they fade very easily in light. So they have beautiful colors for copying digitally, but you don't want to use these for anything that you want to last a super long time out in the light. I used the Deleter White 2 ink and the Dr. Martin's Bleed Proof White ink for highlights. I used this Zebra brush pen for the initial line work. I used Arch's hot pressed watercolor paper, and I used Faux sable brushes to do all of the watercolor. From playing around with the Radiant watercolors, one thing I learned really quickly was that these work best when you layer them and you build up bright colors using essentially color theory. I wanted to end up with really bright greens, so I figured the best way to achieve that would be to start with a layer of this bright yellow. So I'm going first over the face, and I'm also going to be going over parts of the leaves and the petals with this bright yellow, and I'm doing a full coat of it over the areas that I want to be the brightest green, because when I layer the green on top of the yellow layer, it's gonna really pop. It's gonna create a really saturated, vibrant, kind of limey green. So all of the areas I want to be very saturated with any sort of yellow tint, I'm going over with yellow. Next, I mixed up a pretty transparent green by mixing green with water. And I'm starting very transparent, going over the nasturtium leaves with the very transparent green, and I'm going to be slowly building up the green colors that I want. And then I'll be going over the petals with orange, so those are yellow right now too, and they're going to be built up with orange later. Alright, just to keep you guys updated on the colors that I've been using, I started with a coat of 1A yellow, and then I followed that up with 11A green, and I also will be pulling in some 12A kind of tealy green later on. But right now what you see is the initial coat of the 1A yellow, which I used all over everywhere that you see yellow, and then the 11A green, I'm blending with different amounts of water to achieve different transparent greens, and then in some areas very opaque green. Like for example, I want the lily pads, well the nasturtium pads, to feel like they have kind of that rippling texture to them, with the leaves being very thin in the creases. So I'm using more opaque watercolor for the areas that of the leaves that I want to feel thicker, and then I'm using a more transparent layer of the green where I want the leaves to feel thinner. So that's one area that these watercolors really excel. They can feel very, very transparent, and then when you layer them up with multiple colors especially, you can get some really, really nice, hearty, saturated colors. So that kind of bluer green that I'm using now, I mixed with some water. That is the 12A, kind of teal blue green. And that one is very, very pigmented, so I mixed it with a lot of water to get a transparent wash. And when I layer it with the more yellow greens, we can get some really nice gradients of cool greens working into warmer greens, which is what I really wanted for these. I wanted to have a big range of greens so that my greens wouldn't all feel the same. I want them to feel really cool in some places and then feel like much more warmer greens in other places. Particularly with leaves, the temperature of the leaf, the temperature of the green is often really dependent on where the light is coming from. If the light is coming through a leaf and you're seeing it from the other side, then it often is a very yellow, warm green. When light is hitting it from above and creating highlights, often those highlights are whiter, so you'll get a cooler green. I'm using now the 8A color, and I believe I mixed it with some of the 12A color for the background. I'm also going to be using that same color to start coming in with some transparent shadow layers. But first I have to fill in the body and of course the face with a nice warm limey green that I'm layering right over top of the yellow. So I'm using the 11A green again, mixed with a lot of water so that I can transparently layer it with the yellow that I put in earlier to get those really, really nice warm lime greens. Then I'm layering 2A and 3A orange and red colors over the flowers, the nasturtium blossoms, because I want them to start having these really nice pops of orange and red. So I'm going right over the yellow that I added to the petals already and just filling it in with the more saturated orange color. I'm then using the red color. I think I used 5A for this, along the edges of the petals. And I'm adding it pretty opaquely, pretty saturated, not mixed with a lot of water, because I really want those reds to feel bright and vibrant. Next, I am using the shadow color that I mixed. It's very, very similar to the color I used for the background. You can see that when it layers with the green, you get these really nice blue-green shadows, and it's super transparent, so I can layer it right on top of the orange petals as well as the green of the body. And it totally functions as a shadow for both. So if you're kind of a digital artist, then this might feel familiar to you, because this is kind of what a multiply layer style in Photoshop or other digital drawing programs feels like. Using that blue transparent shadow over top of the various colors that I put down felt a lot like using a multiply layer, so that felt really familiar, and it was really useful for building up my shadows quickly. It's something that I'm a little unfamiliar with. I'm not very experienced with watercolors yet, so I feel like in the future I'll be able to use it better and maybe mix up some slightly different shades of blue for the different areas of the face. For example, the whites and then the shadow under the head could be different shades of blue just based on their proximity to the light. But I felt really good about using this method, and hopefully if you try it, it's useful for you too. I'm layering the shadow layer over top of the area under the neck pretty opaquely, so I'm not mixing as much water with it for this area so that it will appear really dark. And when it mixes with the petals, it creates some really, really nice, rich, kind of deep brown tones that I liked a lot. I thought that looked really cool, and it really felt like the petals were in a nice deep shadow. One thing that I learned from doing ink work and ink washes that definitely applies to this too is to not let the edges of your watercolor dry too much, because you start getting a hard edge and it can be really, really hard to blend that out. So making sure to fill in the whole area that you're painting before letting it dry, because once it dries, it doesn't really reactivate the same way it ever was when it was wet. Like, you can reactivate it a little bit and start blending out the hard edge, but it will never be as smooth and seamless as if you blend while it's wet. For the sky up here, I'm adding a second layer using the colors 9A and 8A, and mostly 9A, but they are mixed together a little bit. And I'm layering that on top of the blue that I already created, because I wanted the darkness around the creature to start kind of closing in. I really wanted it to be a nice rainy atmosphere, but I wanted to build that up so that I could leave little hints of the lighter color around the rim to create kind of a little bit of a rimlet effect. I'm using that 9A and 8A mixture, and I think there's just a touch of black in there so that it's not full saturation. I'm using that to come in and layer on top of my shadows again on the face and also on the body. And I'm using it as an opportunity to add some of the hair details and to start kind of rendering out the planes of the face. I'm using it here to show the dimension of the nose bridge. I'm really just thinking of it as laying down a transparent shadow, and with each new coat of the shadow, I'm thinking about how I can show the dimension of the face in a new way, so just rendering out a different area. I'm continually layering up my shadows where I want them to be the deepest and darkest, because as I come over with a new coat, each time I want my darkest darks to remain my darkest darks. You know, if I want a shadow area to stand out, when I add a new coat of paint, I need to deepen it each time. And I really love how layerable these are. I feel like it works really well with my painting style. So, for example, in the sky here, I'm layering up the blues so that I can leave a little bit of a rim around the edge of the nasturtium leaves. And this will create kind of a glow effect, just because the brighter blue, when it shows around the edge, it will look like a rim highlight, even though it was put on earlier. So it's kind of the opposite order that I would do if I was painting it digitally, but I had to kind of think ahead of that since I'm doing it traditionally and layer it accordingly. I want the nose and the area around the eyes to feel a little bit fleshier, kind of pinky purple. So I mixed up a combination of 7A and 9A for the pinky purple. It's a pretty dull purple because since it's kind of outside of the palette that I've been using, I don't want it to dominate the attention too much. I really want the eyes and those orange flowers to be what pops forward, rather than like the super saturated pink around the eyes and nose. I didn't do a great job with the pupils initially, but honestly, mistakes are pretty well tolerated by this paint. Like, it's okay if you mess up occasionally, especially because you can go over the top of this with colored pencils if you need to make small corrections, which is what I ended up doing at the end. So I wasn't super worried about making little mistakes if my edges weren't perfect, because, you know, for a medium that is thought of as totally unforgiving, with how transparent these are, it's actually possible to layer them up in a way that could kind of hide mistakes a little bit. You'll see in just a minute that I actually make kind of a mistake with the eye. I'm shading with this darker color and my eye is still wet. So when I come over, it starts seeping into my eye, which is definitely not ideal. But I took a little piece of paper towel and I just kind of started dabbing the color up. And it came up enough that it wasn't even really noticeable by the end of the piece. So, you know, it's okay to make little mistakes if you're fast acting, and no one will really ever know. You know, if you work with it, then it can become a feature of the piece rather than a mistake. Maybe this creature has slight heterochromia or something like that. But no one even could really tell by the end. So, you know, if something happens like that where you mix wet into wet and it starts bleeding, just don't panic. Make sure you've got some paper towels nearby to soak it up and you should be good. So the next thing that I'm doing is I mixed some of my white ink. I used both white inks that I showed earlier, the Deleter white ink and the Dr. Martens white ink. I used them in different locations on this. I mixed some of the white ink with watercolor, with like blue watercolor, in order to create this opaque light blue color that I'm using now as a way to add light details like whiskers and pieces of fur that are sticking out. I'm using a really tiny size 0 brush to add these in, which gives me a nice fine point, and that's perfect for doing things like adding whiskers. And I've found this is easier than trying to do it with a pen, because I have some really nice white ink pens like the Signo Uniball pen is really great, but first of all, I can't mix it with the watercolor, and it's harder to get as fine of a point. But I've heard that there are some pens that have opaque white ink in them and also have a brush tip. So I'm going to be looking into those and seeing if any of those would be good for this. This step is really calming to me, and I feel like it also really adds a lot of dimension to the piece. It kind of punches it up into our world and makes it feel a lot more real. I also just really love adding highlights. It's one of my favorite parts of any piece. It just feels really calming and nice, and I always look forward to it because I feel like it makes the surfaces that you're adding highlights to look so much better and more three-dimensional really quickly. Like, it's amazing how much one little specular highlight can add to a piece. I also really like just doing it along the edge of something, along the rim, because I feel like it helps make those transitions between different areas of the piece, like between the background and the face, feel a lot more natural and three-dimensional rather than like a thick ink line. So I have some tips for when you're doing this. The first is to practice a lot with your brush, because you want to be able to use a really, really light touch to get really thin lines. And then you also want to be able to press down harder to get thicker lines. So I did a lot of practice during my Inktober series when I was doing ink drawings every day for a month, because I was using this brush to do line work. So now coming in and using it for highlights feels pretty natural, but it takes some time to build up the muscle memory with brushes. So just doing things like trying to paint over lines that you've drawn with pencil is really useful. The next thing is that you can mix it with water, and getting it nice and wet, very wet, will help it go on more smoothly. Because if you don't want that kind of grainy texture, grainy dry brush texture, then you need to get the paint pretty wet, or the ink pretty wet. And if you do want that grainier dry brush texture, which can actually look really nice with highlights sometimes, then just leave the mixture drier rather than wetter. You can also do different transparencies of your highlights. They don't all need to be super opaque. You know, if you want some of them to feel more transparent, like if some of the whiskers should feel more transparent in some places, then you can add more water to it. And then it gives you the opportunity, like I'm doing right now, to come in with even finer specular highlights. Like I'm coming in with white and I'm adding highlight to the whiskers that were my last highlight layer. I like that a lot because I feel like it adds even more dimension. I'm doing it in the eyes too. And I just really like my pieces to look dimensional. I want them to feel like they're coming forward toward you off the page. And anything that I can do that adds that feeling is something that I try to prioritize in my pieces. Going along the outside of the nasturtium leaves and along the top of the water droplets is something that if you're not as practiced with using a brush, you might find doing this kind of motion kind of troublesome at first. But if you just practice going along top of, pencil marks, any sort of wavy marks, and trying to follow it, it's just muscle memory, and you'll totally build it up. Everyone who spends time doing it, it'll happen eventually. And I think that it was only doing an ink drawing every single day for a month that I kind of got that experience with the brush that made me feel a little more confident. I'm still not great at it, but I feel like I can more confidently kind of follow along a wavy line, the perimeter of something with my highlight brush, and then also get those nice highlights on the water. I want the creature to feel like it's covered in dew all over. And rain. It's going to be raining, so rain is more accurate actually. So I'm coming in and adding little tiny droplets all over the fur. My rain isn't super realistic. I would say it's more kind of like animated rain something like in a Studio Ghibli movie rather than super realistic rain, but I really kind of like the effect that gives. I feel like it makes it feel really immediate. I really like going all in on weather effects. Like when I'm adding weather to a piece, I want to think of all of the different ways that it could interact with the piece, because I feel like it adds a lot of reality and it makes it feel like you're right there in the scene with the character. So, like I mentioned earlier, I'm coming in and just using pencil to do some final little details, some final little corrections, but we're pretty much at the end of the piece. I think it ended up taking me about 3 or 4 hours to do this piece in full. I think that in the future I'd like to spend even more time, but I really liked this. It was my first time using these paints, the Radiant Watercolors, and I thought the colors came out beautiful. It copied beautifully. I bought a scanner recently. I used to photograph all my pieces, but someone suggested I buy a scanner, and I did, and it copied beautifully with the scanner. I hope you enjoyed watching this, and hopefully you learned something. I learned a lot from doing this, so hopefully I can share my missteps and mistakes as I learn watercolor and create some useful content in the process. Let me know in the comments if you have any suggestions for things you'd like to see in the future, and remember to subscribe if you want to see more YouTuber things. Alright, thanks guys. Bye, I'll see you next time.